Welcome back. This is day 2 of asexual reproduction. Today we're talking about how does asexual reproduction form identical daughter cells. So we know a few things about asexual reproduction, okay? We know that there's one parent involved, and we also know that because of that, it's going to produce genetically identical offspring. Okay, so when we talk about identical daughter cells, we're just talking about the offspring of that reproduction. So these cells that are produced as a result of asexual reproduction. Okay, so keeping that in mind, use that to answer questions 1 through 4 on your do now. There are 4 true or false answers. So go through those characteristics and see if they are true or false. Press play when you are ready to review them. All right, number 1, asexual reproduction results in offspring that are identical to the previous generation. This is going to be true because there's only one parent. The offspring are going to be identical to that parent that created them. There's going to be 2 genetically identical offspring. Okay, number 2, in asexual reproduction, 2 parents are involved in creating offspring. This is going to be false. There's only one parent involved with asexual reproduction. All right, number 3, asexual reproduction occurs only in unicellular species. This is false. There are some multicellular species that reproduce asexually. Fungi, some plants, starfish, right, are all examples of organisms that can undergo asexual reproduction. And finally, number 4, asexual reproduction is a way to ensure that there is a wide variety of offspring with many different combinations of DNA. This is also false because, again, with asexual reproduction, we get genetically identical offspring. There is no genetic recombination. There is no genetic variation. They are all exact duplicate copies of the parent cell. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, throughout this unit, you're going to be hearing a lot of new words that can often be very confusing. So I wanted to include this diagram to figure out how does all of this information fit together and where do we find it within us? Okay, so when we're talking about genetic makeup, the first thing we need to keep in mind is your cells. Okay, inside each of your cells, there's a structure or an organelle that holds all of your genetic information, and we know that as the nucleus of your cell. I think my PowerPoint's frozen. There it is. Okay, so the nucleus is going to contain all of the genetic information. And if we zoom in, that genetic information is actually organized in these X-shaped structures called chromosomes. And chromosomes are just really tightly coiled bundles of DNA. Okay, so if we were to zoom in even further on that chromosome, we would just find DNA that has been coiled and coiled really, really tightly into this X-shaped structure. Okay, but if we uncoil it a little bit, we'll eventually find this helical shape, this double, oh, that is ugly. Let's try that again. This double helix shape that hopefully we are all familiar with as DNA. But we're also going to be hearing another word this unit, especially today, and that is something called a gene. So we need to know that gene is just a segment of DNA. So if we look at this coiled structure and we zoom in, maybe this is the gene that codes for hair color, and maybe this is the gene that codes for eye color, and this is the gene that codes for your skin color. Okay, so genes are just segments of DNA that are going to code for different traits in your body. Right, so make sure that we are comfortable with this setup. Okay, make sure you know that chromosomes are made up of DNA and genes are found of segments on that DNA. Okay, the first thing we're going to do, or I guess the second thing we're going to do today is read a quick passage about what exactly is DNA, what are genes, where do we find them, etc. And we're going to use this information in the passage to answer questions 1 through 4 on your paper. So read along with me, make sure you're making any annotations on your paper as we go through this. A gene is a segment of DNA that codes for RNA and protein. A single molecule of DNA has thousands of genes lined up like the cars of a train. When genes are being used, the strand of DNA is stretched out so that the information it contains can be decoded and used to direct the synthesis of proteins needed by the cell. As a eukaryotic cell prepares to divide, the DNA and the proteins associated with the DNA coil into a structure called a chromosome. Before the DNA coils up, however, the DNA is copied. The two exact copies of DNA that make up each chromosome are called chromatids. In the chromatids, the DNA is very condensed. The two chromatids, which become separated during cell division, are placed into each new cell, and that ensures that each new cell has the same genetic information as the original cell. Okay, so now pause this video, answer questions 1 through 4 on your own based on what we just read, and then press play when you are ready to review it. Okay, number 1, how are genes and DNA related? Well, as we just saw in that previous picture, genes are segments of DNA that code for a protein or a specific RNA molecule. And these proteins are going to be what determine your traits, your physical traits, things like hair color, eye color, skin color, all of that is determined by your genes. But what occurs to a DNA strand as its genes are being used? Well, we've said that DNA is basically like the blueprint or the instruction manual for the cell, right? So think of this as like you've just gone to IKEA, you've come home with a brand new dresser, you're so excited. The first thing you're gonna do is lay out that instruction manual and open it so you know how to build that dresser. That's the same thing that happens with our genes and with our DNA. So our DNA is physically stretched out so that all of that information, that instruction manual, can be read and decoded in order to be able to use, that was not a sentence, in order to be used to create proteins and to build those proteins. So DNA really is the instruction manual for the cells. Okay. Number 3, how are chromatids and chromosomes related? Now, this is tricky because both of these words look pretty similar, like a lot of words in science do, but they mean different things. So we need to know that chromatids, two identical chromatids, make up one chromosome. And I've got a picture of what that looks like, but I'm going to have to, actually, I'll leave it. All right, so if you look on this diagram, we see that this X shape is our chromosome, right? But it's actually color-coded to show us what those chromatids look like. So this blue section that I've highlighted right here is one chromatid. Okay, and this red section right here that I've highlighted is another chromatid. But both of those chromatids are joined together to form one complete chromosome. So two chromatids make up one chromosome. They both have to come together to make that X-shaped structure. That also means that these chromatids contain identical genetic information. And that's why we call them sister chromatids, because they're like twin sisters. They contain the same genetic information. They are identical and make up that chromosome together. Okay, so I'm going to write that down. Two chromatids contain identical genetic info. Okay, and the last question from this passage says, a train is to cars as a molecule of DNA is to what? The answer there is genes, because as we saw, let's see, I'm going to go back to the last slide right here. This double helix DNA structure has lots of different segments that are called genes. The same way, like if this entire structure of DNA is a train, those genes are going to be the train cars that all join together to create the genetic information or make the train work. All right, and that leads us to part C. So I've got a question for you guys. Before a cell can undergo asexual reproduction in order to make new daughter cells, something has to happen inside of the cell to form identical offspring. What has to happen and why does that have to happen? So how is one cell able to form two identical offspring? Okay, pause this video, answer that question, and then press play when you're ready to go over it. Okay, so how does one cell produce two identical offspring cells? How does that happen? Well, the first thing that has to happen is the DNA has to be duplicated or doubled so that when those cells split into two, each cell has an identical copy of DNA. Okay, so it's super important that that DNA be duplicated or doubled so that when they split, each cell takes its own individual copy of DNA that is identical to the original parent cell. Okay. Now, yesterday I told you guys that humans don't reproduce asexually, right? We can't, if I can't just produce a baby by myself, okay? But our cells actually do. Our cells undergo asexual reproduction through something called mitosis. So this is what our body cells use to regenerate and produce more cells. Right? And I've got a diagram of what that looks like. So what exactly is mitosis? Well, we need to know that this is a type of cell division where one cell divides to, again, create two genetically identical cells. So we start with one parent cell, and then we end with two identical daughter cells. But we just said that in order for this to happen, in order for these two cells to be identical, the nucleus has to actually divide in order to form two nuclei. Right, so here is the nucleus. This genetic information is going to double so that eventually each cell has their own individual nucleus with the same genetic information. And again, we need to know that this is how our body cells make new body cells. You will also see the word somatic cells used for this. Somatic is just another word for body cells. This means that your skin cells, your nerve cells, your muscle cells all reproduce through mitosis. This is how new body cells and new somatic cells are made. Okay, now these are actually the two diagrams that are on your notes right now. I'm going to quickly go over those. This is showing the exact same thing. Okay, we start with one parent cell, and we're going to end with two genetically identical daughter cells. But in order for that to happen, this middle step is super important. The DNA has to replicate and duplicate so that each one of these cells gets the same genetic information as that parent cell. So eventually, these two daughter cells, that is not a star, are exactly identical to this parent cell. So again, because this is a type of asexual reproduction, we're producing identical daughter cells. Now, you'll also see this diagram on the right on your paper, but what the heck does this 2N mean? You will often see this, and 2N is a way to designate that this is something called a diploid cell, which just means that it has the full or complete set of chromosomes. So in humans, our diploid number is 46 because we have 46 chromosomes. And this diagram is showing you that at the beginning and the end of mitosis, every cell is going to eventually start and end with 46 chromosomes, a full or complete set of chromosomes. So we call that 2N number the diploid number. And then tomorrow, I believe, we'll also learn about something called a haploid number. But I'll let you guys predict what you think that means. And then we'll learn about it tomorrow. So now use this information to complete your exit ticket. Let me know if you have any questions and have a wonderful afternoon.